Hey guys, tonight we wander into the stone corridors of a forgotten time, one not drenched in blood, but powdered in dust, silence, and strange ideas. Most people imagine torture as loud, as cruel shrieks and screams, but what if it's actually quiet? What if it lingers more in the anticipation than the agony? Medieval torture wasn't always about pain, it was about theater, paperwork, and the slow orchestration of fear. You don't notice it at first, but once you realize how much planning went into these things, it's almost funny. Not haha funny, but committee funny. Like 10 men with feathered hats gathering to design an iron chair with just the right number of spikes. And you probably won't survive this tale, not because of the gore, but because you'll be lulled into wondering how many of these tools were ever truly used, and how many just sat there, grinning quietly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in a cold stone chamber, not a dungeon. Exactly. Just a room with bad intentions. A wooden table, a few ropes, some chains on the wall. But most of all, a silence that doesn't feel empty. You're not here for chaos. You're here for unstructure, for a system that decided how much pain was appropriate to extract a confession. Medieval torture wasn't always a rogue act of cruelty. Often, it was official, legal, scheduled. You showed up for your appointment, and so did your interrogators. They had notes, tools, a clerk. There were even witnesses, just in case anything historically questionable happened. The devices themselves were strange things, half invention, half intimidation. A torture tool didn't have to be used to work. Its very presence could soften a prisoner's resolve like heat on wax. Imagine being led into a room where the walls were lined with gleaming iron devices, too sharp to be furniture, too clean to be used, too deliberate to be decoration. You're handed a cup of water, not out of kindness, but to wet your throat so when the questions come, your voice won't crack too soon. One of the earliest and least discussed tools wasn't made of metal at all. It was language, words spoken in a low voice, the threat of what might happen if you stayed silent. Because in many cases, the pain never came, or it came slowly, incrementally, in tiny humiliations. Standing for hours, being forced to kneel, sleep deprivation, and all of it done with the air of a very unfortunate procedure. No rage, no frenzy, just method. This wasn't about losing control. It was about taking it. You'd think these torturers were monsters, but many were just employees, following procedure, filling in forms. There were even laws about how many minutes of torture were permitted. There were breaks, water. Sometimes, get this, a doctor was present to ensure you didn't die too quickly. That wasn't good for paperwork. And if you died before signing your confession, well, that was a whole other department's problem. So yes, you were tortured, but within guidelines. Historians still argue whether these devices were widely used, or mostly displayed as warnings. Some records suggest that many of them were rarely, if ever, applied. They were props in a psychological game. It's the medieval version of a "do not press this button" sign. People didn't need to see it pressed. They just needed to believe someone had. That the last person who sat in that chair never walked again. That the man who laughed during his first session wept by the second. Reality didn't matter, only the belief. That's why so many of these tools were designed with such flair. Why else put faces on masks of shame, spikes on chairs, or carving on execution axes? Because pain isn't just a sensation, it's an aesthetic. If you're going to break a person, make it look like they're being broken, even if they aren't. Even if all they did was sit in a cold room while someone slowly read a list of crimes, true or not. In a way, the Middle Ages invented the vibe check. And if you didn't pass, the real tools came out. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The first stage was always soft. You might be tied, but gently, questioned, but with politeness. There were protocols. Torture, contrary to movies, wasn't usually the first choice, it was the last resort. And often, it wasn't even about discovering truth. It was about closure, for the state, for the crowd, for the record books. If someone confessed, that meant the system worked. And if they didn't, well, there was always next time. One mainstream historical fact that surprises many is that torture was officially regulated by legal codes, especially in places like the Holy Roman Empire. You couldn't just start twisting limbs for fun. There had to be a reason, a sequence. You had to record the method, the duration, and even get this, the subject's mood. Slightly defiant, visibly anxious, crying but cooperative, like Yelp reviews, but more ominous. The clerks wrote with care, their quills scratching like quiet screams on parchment, and those notes still exist, tucked in archives, libraries, and monasteries. Whole pages about who was tied to what, and how long it took for them to remember their heresy. Sometimes the prisoners sang quickly, other times they refused, even at the cost of bones, or worse. There were cases where the accused went through 3 sessions, each more intense than the last, before finally nodding through cracked lips. Yes, yes, I did it. And the funny part, what they confessed to might not have mattered. It just had to sound convincing. A lesser-known detail, the torturers themselves had favorites, not people tools. Some preferred rope, others liked pins. One man reportedly used the same wooden wedge for 20 years, claimed it got to the truth quicker. There was pride, oddly enough, a sense of craftsmanship. If you could get a man to talk without breaking his legs, that was art. A good torturer didn't just use pain, he orchestrated it, and that, weirdly, earned respect. One fringe theory even suggests that certain tools were designed more for display at public trials than for use in secret chambers. Like the modern-day set dressing, their function was theatrical, a kind of moral intimidation. You weren't just being punished, you were being seen being punished. And if you could see the tool that might be used on you next, you might answer more quickly. Confess, cry, point fingers. So here you are, in a chamber not meant for screams, but sighs. You haven't been touched yet, but you've seen enough. The chair, the hooks, the distant table with leather straps, and the man who sits in the corner, not speaking, just watching. Is he the torturer or the clerk? You can't tell, and that's the point. The ambiguity is the device. The room is the weapon. The fear is already doing its work. You're ushered now toward a chair, not just any chair, but the chair. It looks ordinary from a distance, wooden and throne-like. Maybe something a lesser noble might sit in during a very boring meeting. But as you step closer, your eyes adjust to its true design. The surface is embedded with hundreds of dull iron spikes on the seat, the backrest, even the armrests. This is the torture chair, often called the interrogation chair, but its real name could be something quieter, more unsettling, the chair that never sleeps. Because once someone sat down, time bent differently. They didn't scream right away. That wasn't the point. This chair didn't kill quickly, and it wasn't meant to. It wasn't even necessarily meant to cause injury. Its genius was in how little it actually did while making you think it could do so much more. You lower yourself onto it in your imagination, the chill of the metal pressing through your clothes. The spikes don't pierce your skin, but they might as well. You shift slightly. Every movement reminds you of where you are. Your spine tingles not from damage, but from dread. Even before the ropes tighten, you've begun to talk, maybe not the full truth, but enough to delay the next step. Historically, versions of this chair were used throughout Europe, with variations depending on the local flair for discomfort. Some included mechanisms to heat the chair from below, turning iron discomfort into a slow roast. Others had arm or leg clamps that pressed the limbs against the spikes with gentle, unrelenting pressure. But most of the pain didn't come from bleeding. It came from fear. Fear of what would happen if you didn't bleed. Imagine sitting like that for hours, unable to shift, sweat pooling in your lower back, the sense of each breath nudging your skin a fraction deeper into the points. You start to feel pressure where there isn't any, imagining punctures that haven't happened yet. That's the brilliance of this chair. It made you your own torturer. It made your anticipation of pain worse than pain itself. Historians still debate how often this chair was actually used for full-blown interrogations. Some scholars argue it was more symbolic, dragged into courtrooms, or kept visible in prison halls just to be looked at. A reminder, a suggestion. Others believe it was one of the most regularly employed tools in certain regions, particularly during heresy trials or accusations of treason. The truth, Like most things from the medieval world, is probably somewhere between theater and horror. The chair existed, people sat in it, some left alive, some didn't. But what mattered most was that everyone believed in it. There's a lesser-known story from 15th century Germany involving a prisoner who refused to speak during his first trial. He was brought to the torture chamber, shown the chair, and told to sit just for a moment. No heat, no straps, no pressure, just the chair. The man reportedly broke down within 30 minutes, confessing not only to the charges but to several others that weren't even part of the case. He wept while listing the names of people who hadn't been accused yet. He asked for forgiveness before anything had happened. And then, as the story goes, he fainted. The chair hadn't drawn a drop of blood, but it had spilled something else dignity. Perhaps that might have been its true purpose all along. There's something darkly clever about how much thought went into this furniture of fear. It wasn't just built, it was crafted. The spikes were often hand-forged, not sharpened like knives, but tapered just enough to make them miserable under pressure. Too sharp, and you'd bleed too early. Too dull, and they'd be ignored. The dimensions of the seat were often narrow, forcing you to sit with your back unnaturally straight. Any slouch would drive your spine into the iron. The psychology behind it is chilling. This chair didn't act. It waited, like a predator that didn't need to run because it had already trapped you. You might be wondering why a chair, why not something flashier blades, fire, whips? But that's the genius of medieval mindset. Pain wasn't just spectacle, it was administration. A chair let you sit and be questioned. Hands visible, body restrained, mind slowly unraveling. It could be placed in the middle of a chamber, facing your accusers, making you the center of attention while also the most powerless person in the room. It blurred the line between legal procedure and physical torment. You weren't just a suspect, you were now part of the furniture. Something to be examined, prodded, leaned over. The chair didn't kill you. It made you available. One quirky fringe theory claims that some versions of the torture chair were designed with hidden chambers beneath the seat. Small compartments where glowing embers or hot coals could be placed to slowly heat the iron. This, allegedly, would make the spikes warm over time, intensifying the discomfort with a creeping sense of heat. The skin wouldn't burn outright, but it would flush, itch, blister. Others dismissed this as an embellishment, a flourish added by overzealous chroniclers or later museums hoping to spice up their exhibits. But whether or not this design was real, the idea of it was enough. Again, belief is the core ingredient. There's something bizarrely intimate about a torture chair. Unlike devices that operate from a distance, a whip, a rack, a stretching pulley, the chair's close. It requires someone to stand beside you, to tie the ropes, to lean in and whisper questions. You can smell their breath, see their eyes. You're both participating in something you don't entirely understand. That's what makes it different from just pain. It becomes a ritual, a slow, strange dance of question, denial, pressure, silence, confession. You might find it odd, but the torture chair also carried bureaucratic weight. Records of its use were often meticulously kept. Interrogators documented everything from the time of entry to the angle of restraint. Subject was placed in the chair at the second hour of morning bell, exhibited signs of discomfort by the third hour, confessed by midday. There's something uncomfortably modern about the way it was all logged. Imagine a medieval spreadsheet filled with columns labeled duration, intensity, reaction. These weren't wild men torturing out of rage. These were administrators of suffering. A mainstream historical fact often lost in the drama is that torture, including use of chairs like these, was legally sanctioned in many parts of Europe, particularly after the 13th century. The church permitted it under specific circumstances. So did state courts. The right to torture was a legal privilege that came with paperwork, limits, and occasionally audiences. You weren't just tortured in the dark. Sometimes you were tortured by appointment. So now, you sit in that chair. The clerk stands ready with his parchment. The interrogator is tightening the wrist straps. Not cruelly, just firmly. You haven't been accused of anything too dramatic, just heresy, treason, conspiracy, a few whispered rumors, nothing major, but enough to warrant this. The spikes press through your robe. You shift, they follow. You speak, they listen. You pause, they lean closer. The air feels heavy, like it's thinking for you. The questions start again, and you answer, because what choice do you really have? Now they guide you to the rack, and there's a peculiar formality in the way it's done, like you're being led to a fitting, or maybe a very unfortunate massage table. It's a large wooden frame, long enough for a grown man to lie on, with rollers at each end and ropes trailing out like the limbs of something ancient and patient. The rack is infamous. Of course you've heard about it, seen dramatized versions of it in films, always exaggerated for effect. But here in the quiet of this chamber, with its low, flickering torchlight and a faint smell of iron and damp wood, it's not monstrous. It's clinical, simple, the kind of horror that doesn't shout. It only waits. You lie down, stiff-backed and uncertain, and before anything begins, the ropes are already working their trick, one at your wrists, one at your ankles, each pulled taut enough to let you feel their presence, but not so tight that you're in pain. Yet, the man assigned to the crank, because yes, there's a man whose job is to turn the crank steps forward. He doesn't look like a villain. He looks like a farmer, worn hands, blank eyes, a kind of tired mercy in the way he avoids your gaze. You almost want to ask him what he eats for breakfast. He probably says a prayer before every shift. He probably thinks this is just part of God's great machinery. The clerk nods, and with a sound like a rope being drawn across old wood, the tension tightens. Just a fraction, enough to extend your arms by half an inch. You feel it first in the shoulders, something pulling back there that isn't supposed to pull. It's not agony. It's a suggestion. Like the room is leaning in and saying, "We can go further if you'd like." The rack, contrary to legend, wasn't always about snapping limbs. In fact, historians still argue whether dislocations were the goal or the side effect. Some say the point was to stretch the body just enough to instill terror, forcing the accused to imagine their joints popping, their tendons snapping like ropes too long in the sun. Others believe it was used more surgically, applying precise pressure until the prisoner's resistance cracked before their bones did. A confession just before the break that was ideal. That was clean. A screaming heap of flesh was a paperwork problem. And yes, there were guidelines. The stretching had to be gradual. There were often stages, timed intervals between cranks, and a witness to confirm each movement. They didn't just pull wildly. That would be barbaric. No, this was a slow unfurling, like turning a wheel to wind a delicate timepiece. Except the ticking was the sound of your ligaments beginning to strain. Some victims endured hours on the rack with nothing more than elongated limbs and bruised pride. Others collapsed into dislocated joints and blurred vision, their eyes flooding with something more than pain betrayal. Perhaps betrayal by the state or by their own body for giving in. One quirky tidbit often overlooked is that in certain regions, the rack was called the Duke's Bed, a name that adds a truly unsettling contrast, doesn't it? As if it were a resting place, a comfort. There are accounts of prisoners joking about it, dark humor, the last defense of the condemned. "I'm off to the Duke's bed," one man said as he was led away. "Hope he left it warm." Gallows humor, the kind that makes the clerk chuckle and the torturer sigh. But here's the thing, they weren't always cruel. At least not obviously. Many of the men involved in these interrogations saw themselves as neutral, like technicians. They didn't hate you. They didn't even necessarily believe you were guilty. They were following rules, steps, patterns. In some cases, the torturer would warn the accused gently, "Tell them now, and we won't tighten further." He'd leave the crank untouched for long minutes, giving you a chance to confess, to reconsider. It wasn't about violence, it was about control, a ritual of submission. A mainstream historical fact is that the rack was often used in tandem with verbal interrogation. Questions were posed between cranks, not during. This gave the prisoner moments to weigh the pain, compare it to the silence, and calculate how much longer they could endure. Some confess immediately, others resist through several turns, sometimes even fainting only to be revived, questioned again, and return to the same slow stretching. It's not a straight line, it's a cycle, and the more you endure, the more they wonder what you're hiding. You shift slightly, the ropes tug, the wheel creaks. There's something medieval in that sound, something final. You look up and see the ceiling beams. You wonder how many others stared at those same beams, biting their lips until blood bloomed. Maybe one person counted the boards. Maybe another sang a song in their head, the same verse over and over, until the chorus drowned out the pain. Whatever they did, it wasn't enough. You're still here. You're still being pulled. The rack had its cousins, of course. The strappado, a favorite among Inquisition chambers, involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and suspending them from the ceiling. A sudden drop would wrench the arms violently, often dislocating shoulders in a single motion, quicker than the rack. Less paperwork, but perhaps less satisfying too. The rack was slow, elegant, like a sermon in pain. It didn't punish you, it invited you, step by step, stretch by stretch, until the truth came free. Historians continued to debate how often the rack was actually used compared to how often it was threatened. There's evidence suggesting that many interrogations ended without physical action. The mere presence of the rack was enough. A dusty device in the corner, draped with a cloth, accidentally uncovered just as the accused began to dig in their heels. One crank forward, just for demonstration. No one touched, no one harmed, but someone changed their mind. You lie there now, stretched slightly beyond comfort. You're not torn, but you feel torn, and your mind starts to wander not just from the pain, but from the waiting. Time becomes syrupy. You're not sure how long it's been. An hour, 10 minutes. You swear the ceiling's gotten closer, or maybe your arms are just longer now. The questions resume. A voice from the shadows. Tell us again where you were on the night of the feast. You swallow. Your shoulder whispers warnings to your brain. Another crank. The rope tightens like a promise. Not a threat, a promise. Tell us now, the voice says, before we remember the next notch. And just when you think you can't go further, when the edge of dislocation looms like a silent bell, waiting to toll the tension stops, they pause. Not from mercy, but strategy. They know the pause can break you more than the crank. You've seen what's possible. You've felt the ropes. Your mind is racing, running ahead to places your body isn't sure it wants to follow. That's when most people confess, right after the tension stops. Not when the pain is loud, but when it's quiet again. That quiet is unbearable. That quiet says, we are not finished. They bring out something smaller now, something deceptively ornate, something that looks less like a torture device and more like an odd piece of tableware, the kind of trinket a merchant might display under glass. You wouldn't notice it at first if you passed it in a museum, a shiny, metallic bulb that splits into delicate petals when turned. It's called the pear of anguish. And no, it was never meant to be eaten. Though you can't help but think that someone somewhere must have joked about that at the wrong time. The object itself is simple foreleaves or lobes that open outward when twisted, like a blooming flower, but the bloom happens inside you, designed for insertion into the mouth, the anus, or the vagina, depending on the accusation, blasphemy, sodomy, or adultery. This little pear was said to expand slowly inside the body until internal tearing, severe pain, and lasting damage took hold, or so the stories go. Because despite how popular the device is in pop history videos and dark tourism exhibits, historians still argue whether it was ever truly used, or whether it was an elaborate hoax that somehow wormed its way into our collective imagination like a splinter that never heals. You hold it now, just in thought, feeling the weight of it, the cool metal resting against your palm. It's not large. It fits easily in your hand, almost elegant in its construction. Some versions are engraved, others smooth, but all share that awful function, the slow twist that forces the petals outward. The idea alone is enough to make you shift in your seat. But was it real? That's the eternal question. Some scholars believe the pear of anguish was a Renaissance creation, not medieval at all, perhaps a product of the 17th century's flair for anatomical grotesquerie. Others argue that it never functioned as a torture device at all, but rather as a medical tool or even a theatrical prop. There's even the unsettling possibility that it was made after the time it was supposedly used, forged centuries later just to fill a display case and sell a story. Regardless of origin, its symbolism endures. The pear becomes a kind of anti-grail, an object that turns shame into spectacle. What made it so disturbing wasn't just its use, it was where it was used. Inside you. Hidden. intimate. You weren't just hurt, you were invaded, and not publicly either. These were punishments performed in secret, away from the crowds, not because they were too cruel, but because they were too shameful to be witnessed. There was a kind of hierarchy to medieval pain. Some was meant to be seen, to serve as a warning. Other forms were private, like whispered curses. The pear belonged to that second category. The fringe debates don't stop with its origin. Some experts claim that no historical record ever describes its actual use. No court documents, no torture transcripts, just mentions in texts that feel more like gossip than fact. Others point to 19th century collections' French cabinets of curiosities, especially where dozens of these devices were displayed as authentic torture relics, even though no one could say who used them or how they got there. Were they fabricated by collectors? Was the horror invented to satisfy Victorian thrill seekers? There's a kind of irony in the possibility that a torture device may have tortured no one, but continues to torment our imagination centuries later. Still, it shows up in modern retellings like Clockwork. You've seen it, haven't you? In documentaries, in games, in that oddly long YouTube video you didn't mean to finish. And every time, the presenter leans in, voice hushed, describing how the pear was inserted and slowly twisted, the lobes blooming with surgical cruelty. The pain is always emphasized. The aftermath is always vague. That's because the truth is missing. What we have is speculation, and speculation is fertile ground for fear. There's something especially unsettling about how targeted this device was. Unlike broad, theatrical tortures, the rack, the wheel, the chair, the pear was specific. You had to be chosen for it. It wasn't a general punishment. It was customized shame. If you were accused of lying about your faith, the pear went into your mouth, tearing your ability to speak. If you were accused of sodomy or adultery, it was inserted elsewhere, a literal rendering of your crime as pain. It wasn't just punishment, it was metaphor. And metaphors hurt more when they're forced under the skin. You wonder who invented it. If anyone ever did. Did someone sit in a quiet workshop, sketching out a flower that opens under tension? Not for beauty, but for torment. Did they smile as they soldered the petals in place, imagining their future victim frozen in horror? Or maybe it was made by someone who never thought it would be used, just a blacksmith, testing the limits of mechanism, unaware of what history would do with their design. There's always that possibility that this device, like many others, was born innocent and corrupted by context. What makes the pear linger in your thoughts isn't just the shape, it's the quiet. Unlike other devices, it doesn't creak or groan or clang. It doesn't shout its purpose. It works in silence. The only sound is the soft turning of the screw, the breath of the accused, the whispered commands. It's a torture device designed for intimacy, and that, in its way, is more horrifying than any loud punishment. It's the sort of thing that leaves no echo, only scars. A mainstream historical fact to consider is that many alleged torture devices, like the pear, were actually reconstructed or even fabricated during later centuries, especially during the Enlightenment and into the 19th century. The goal was not accuracy, it was drama. Traveling museums, royal collectors, and early historians often sensationalized the brutality of the past, sometimes to criticize the cruelty of the church, sometimes just to impress wealthy patrons. And once a story like the pear entered circulation, it stuck. Truth became optional. All that mattered was the reaction. You picture now the accused, tied down or held in place, told what was coming. The pear's held up gleaming, precise, final. It's not inserted yet. It doesn't need to be. Just the sight of it is enough to make most people weep. And if you were truly unlucky, if they believed you deserved it, they would begin, slowly, one turn at a time. Not to kill you, just to unmake you, piece by piece. And when it was over, the damage wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The pain passed, perhaps, but the silence remained. Even now, you find yourself unsure. Was it real? Was it myth? Does it matter? The fear it causes is real enough. Maybe that's all a torture device ever needed to be. Not effective, not even used, just believable. The pair sits quietly in the museum case. It doesn't move. It doesn't glow. But you can't stop looking at it. Your mind turns it over, again and again, like a key without a lock. You imagine the hands that once held it, the eyes that watched it bloom, the voice that whispered, "Confess now, or we begin." And maybe, just maybe, that whisper never stopped. Maybe it's still with us, waiting. Now you're walking again, back through corridors that echo too easily, the walls just a little too damp to be comforting, until you find yourself face to face with perhaps the most famous torture device of all the Iron Maiden. Tall, cold, and unmistakably theatrical. It towers over you like a frozen queen, its doors slightly ajar as if it's mid-sentence. You've probably seen it before, in horror films or spooky castles, always with the same story, a sarcophagus lined with spikes, ready to close shut and impale the poor soul trapped inside. But here's the strange truth: the real Iron Maiden, as you've imagined it, likely never existed in the Middle Ages, not in that form, not as it's been sold to you. Historians still argue whether the Iron Maiden is a genuine medieval invention or a brilliant lie, crafted centuries later to give shape to our darkest assumptions about the past. Because it feels so real, doesn't it? You see the tall form, you imagine the screaming, you see the blood pooling at the feet. It writes itself, but history, as usual, is more complicated and often quieter. The Iron Maiden, or at least the image of it, rose to fame in the 19th century, particularly in Germany. That's where the infamous Nuremberg Virgin comes into play, a tall, hinged device said to have been used to execute or interrogate with terrifying precision, inside long iron spikes, designed not to kill instantly, but to pierce just enough to cause extreme pain and slow death. The victim wouldn't be stabbed through, that would be merciful. No, they'd be punctured in non-lethal places, between the ribs, along the arms, the abdomen, enough to bleed, to suffer, but not enough to die quickly. That was the tale, at least. But when modern historians examined the evidence, they found inconsistencies. The construction didn't align with medieval materials. The records were sparse. Many now believe the Iron Maiden was created in the 1700s or later, assembled from parts of other devices, or even made entirely from imagination. It was a product of fascination, not fact. Still, the Iron Maiden persisted in museums and mines. It looked real, and that's all it needed. One particular version in a 19th century museum in London was revealed to be an outright fabrication, its spikes clearly added after the fact. Another in Nuremberg drew tourists by the thousands, but when dismantled for study, it appeared to be a clever assembly of unrelated components, yet the myth never died. Maybe because it serves such a perfect narrative, a person locked in a coffin of pain, screaming into the iron, completely alone. That image sticks, whether or not it ever truly happened. You step closer now. The doors creak faintly. You peer inside. The spikes, if they're real, are just long enough to make you flinch. You imagine them pressing into your chest, your legs, your back. It wouldn't be an explosion of pain. It would be a suffocation, a slow realization that you can't move without piercing deeper, a trap that punishes breath. It's an elegant kind of cruelty, even if it never existed as used. Someone thought it up, and that says more about us than any bloodied floor ever could. A quirky fringe detail buried in the myth of the Iron Maiden is the suggestion that it was used specifically for religious blasphemers, with spikes positioned to avoid vital organs so that the victim could stay alive for as long as possible, usually several hours, sometimes days, with priests standing nearby to encourage confession. There's no concrete evidence for this, but the story surfaces again and again, as if history itself wants it to be true. Maybe because we like to think pain and morality walked hand in hand, that justice was sharp, literal, and metallic. It's easier to sleep at night if we believe the wicked were punished in such precise, poetic ways. One mainstream historical fact is that the concept of enclosing someone in a standing, spiked chamber dates back even further than medieval Europe. Ancient torture myths from Egypt and Rome describe similar punishments, though often without the mechanical flair of the Iron Maiden. These were more symbolic sealed rooms, starvation boxes, spiked pits. But the idea of being surrounded by the thing that kills you that's old, that's primal. The Iron Maiden is just its most gothic incarnation. There's also something performative about it, isn't there? You can't use an Iron Maiden in secret. It's tall, heavy, ornate. It's meant to be seen, to be displayed. Even now, when we visit museums, we stand in front of them and marvel. We don't ask about logistics, how you clean the blood, how you pull the body out, how many people it would take to close the doors. We just stare. The form is enough. It's a lie wrapped in very convincing truth. And maybe that's what it was all along. Not a tool of torture, but a prop. Something a ruler might point to and say, obey. Or, but that will be you. A relic not of cruelty, but of threat. Even so, you can't shake the image. Standing inside, your hands bound, your body trembling, the doors inching closed. The spikes don't hurt yet, but they're there. You can feel them like teeth waiting to bite. You shift slightly, just slightly, and the one behind your knee grazes skin. Not a cut, not yet, but the promise is there. You begin to understand how the fear itself could be worse than the mechanism. The imagination does most of the work. The maiden doesn't have to move. She just has to exist. There's also something oddly feminine about the name. Isn't there maiden? It softens the horror, makes it feel like a paradox, a virginal figure that kills, an innocent shape that conceals menace. Scholars have debated this naming for decades. Some say it was a metaphor for purity betrayed. Others believe it was simply marketing an exotic name to lure in crowds. After all, the Victorians loved a good contradiction. The more confusing, the better. Pain wrapped in innocence. Blood in a bridal gown. You stare longer than you meant to. The Iron Maiden stands still, but she pulls you in. Your breath fogs the space in front of her, though you can't tell if it's from fear or fascination. And even though logic tells you she was never real in the way you've been told, that she was likely a 19th century fabrication designed for maximum legend, not function, you still step back, just in case. And maybe that's the real story. Not that the Iron Maiden was used, but that we wanted it to be. We wanted a device so poetically terrifying, so efficient in its metaphor, that it didn't matter if it had ever touched flesh. It had already pierced our minds. And what better torture than that? After the towering dread of the Iron Maiden, your eyes adjust to something much smaller, almost harmless at a glance, a pair of metal clamps resting on a stone table. No larger than a child's toy, but looks deceived here more than anywhere else in this dark parade. These are thumbscrews, and nearby, a variation for toes, tiny devices, quiet ones. But if the Iron Maiden was about spectacle, these tools were about intimacy, control, and the slow, methodical unraveling of a person one digit at a time. You pick one up just in your mind and feel the weight. It's heavier than you'd expect. Forged iron with tiny threads carved into the turning bolt. Simple technology. Really, 2 flat plates, a screw. That's all it took. The victim would place a finger or toe or have it placed between those plates. Then the bolt would turn, a little at a time. With each twist, pressure increased. Bones didn't shatter all at once. They crushed, gradually. A whisper of cracking, a bloom of heat, and the kind of pain that felt personal, focused, like a bad thought that won't leave you alone. Despite their size, thumbscrews were surprisingly versatile. They didn't require a torture chamber. They didn't even require much strength. Anyone could operate them: a judge, a clerk, a low-ranking guard. That was part of their charm, if we can use such a word. They democratized suffering, where grander tools like the rack demanded space and spectacle. Thumbscrews could be used in a hallway, in a cell, even mid-transport. And while you might imagine them clamped only on the thumbs, some designs accommodated several fingers at once, or even entire limbs in flattened, enlarged versions. There are whispered accounts of thumbscrews used on ears, noses, or even genitals, though these might be exaggerations. The product of frightened minds inventing worse than reality. Then again, maybe not. Historians still argue whether such modifications were typical practice or the exception. No clear records. Just scattered mentions and the grim certainty that someone, somewhere, tried it. What makes these tools particularly haunting is their subtlety. A person could be tortured and still walk out looking almost intact. Sure, their fingers might be swollen, broken, bent at odd angles, but there was no blood spray, no dramatic flailing, just quiet whimpers and a slow collapse. It wasn't about speed. It was about making the victim choose between silence and destruction. Every turn of the screw offered a deal speak now, and we stop, stay quiet, and we continue. It was a countdown in pain, with only one hand, no fire, no iron spikes, just metal, pressure, and the fear of what happens next. One mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that thumbscrews called pillowinks in some regions were favored by certain legal systems precisely because of their efficiency. They required no elaborate setup, and unlike larger tools, they could be interrupted easily if a confession came mid-process. This made them ideal for situations where torture had to be regulated. Yes, regulated. In many medieval and early modern courts, torture was legally bounded by guidelines. It had to be justified, documented, and performed under specific conditions. The thumbscrew fit perfectly into that bureaucracy. Easy to deploy, easy to stop, pain with a dial. There's also something uniquely psychological about this method, because the hands are where we live, aren't they? We gesture with them, eat with them, write, build, pray. To harm the hands is to wound identity. When the thumbs are crushed, you're not just being hurt, you're being rewritten. You may walk again, you may speak, but you'll never hold a quill or lift a spoon without remembering what was taken. That's the kind of pain that lingers, not the blood, but the consequence. And it wasn't just the accused who suffered. In at least one documented case from 16th century Scotland, a man confessed to theft after 2 rounds of thumbscrews. He pointed the finger at a neighbor, who was then brought in and subjected to the same device. Both men eventually admitted to lying. Why not to spare themselves, but to end the process? Pain created a loop of falsehood. You said what they wanted, or what you thought they wanted, or whatever you could manage before the next click. The truth, whatever it was, dissolved under the pressure. A lesser-known fringe detail suggests that in some areas, thumbscrews were loaned out, literally borrowed between townships, or borrowed by inquisitors traveling from one village to the next. They were portable enough to be stored in saddlebags, carried from trial to trial like a cursed set of reading glasses. "Try these on," the interrogator might say, holding them up. You'll be amazed what comes to mind. There's a terrifying normality in that idea that these devices weren't sacred relics or chamber-bound instruments, but tools, as ordinary to their users as a hammer or a wrench. And the victims not always hardened criminals or suspected heretics. Sometimes it was a baker accused of short-weighing flour. Sometimes it was a woman accused of gossiping about the priest, a merchant suspected of smuggling, a teenager who didn't recite a prayer correctly. The bar for suspicion was often absurdly low, and once you were suspected, you could be held. Once you were held, you could be questioned. And once questioned, well, the thumbscrews were already in the drawer. You think now about the weight of those screws, the way they turned, slowly, deliberately. Each twist was an invitation, not a command, not a beating, but an offer. Give us what we want, and you can have your fingers back. It's a cruel bargain, made worse by the fact that even if you did confess, you might be tortured again just to make sure your confession was real. That's the trick. Torture didn't just extract lies, sometimes it extracted compliance. And compliance looks a lot like truth when everyone wants to go home before nightfall. You might imagine, in your darker moments, what it felt like. Not the first turn, but the third, or the fifth, when the nail starts to lift slightly, when the skin doesn't break, but it peels, when you feel your own bones making decisions for you. That's the real terror. Not what they did to you, but what you agreed to so they'd stop. The moment you say yes just to preserve your last functioning knuckle, that's when they win. You walk away from the table now, or try to, but the image of the screws follows you. It's not dramatic, not cinematic, it's domestic, and that might be what makes it so enduring. The Iron Maiden, the rack, the wheel, they belong to legends. But the thumbscrews, they belong to a desk drawer, a back room, a bored man with a notepad. That's the horror of it. Pain doesn't always roar. Sometimes it clicks. In the far corner of the chamber, resting on a wooden shelf that leans ever so slightly to one side, lies something that doesn't seem dangerous at first. It looks like a bent gardening tool, or maybe a strange rake with claws. 4 curved iron prongs attached to a handle delicately forged, yet brutal in implication. This is the Spanish tickler, sometimes called the cat's paw, a tool of scraping, not slicing. You hold it mentally and the weight surprises you. Heavier than it looks, and cold, always cold. This thing was not designed to kill you. It was designed to unmake you. Flesh was not cut with it. Flesh was ripped, pulled apart in curls and flakes, like bark from a tree or old wallpaper from a damp wall. But here's the twist. The little secret nobody likes to admit: the Spanish tickler wasn't used as often as people think. In many cases, it never touched skin at all. It sat in rooms like a threat, gleaming and quiet. The claws spoke for themselves. Why use it when showing it was enough? That's the genius of psychological torture. The Spanish tickler, in all its crude perfection, was often wielded more as performance than as punishment. Just imagine the interrogator standing over you, holding it delicately by the handle, turning it in the candlelight. "This is next," he whispers, not angrily, not gleefully, just matter of fact, like someone announcing it might rain. And that's when most people broke, because this thing didn't suggest death. It suggested ruin, disfigurement, the permanent tearing of something that doesn't grow back. You could walk away from this tool alive, but never whole. Mainstream historical records confirm that similar clawed implements were indeed used in medieval interrogations and executions, particularly across France and Spain. Some were heated before use, others were used cold. The design varied: a simple 3-pronged version here, a more elaborate multi-hook variant there, but the function remained destruction, mostly for symbolic crimes, heresy, blasphemy, betrayal. These weren't tools of immediate utility. They were ritualistic, used when someone needed to visibly suffer, and even then, only when the court deemed it necessary. Often, the mere display of the tickler was enough to achieve the desired confession. Again, why waste time and energy on actual flaying when imagination could do the job faster? Still, there were cases, documented ones. You imagine a man, let's call him Thomas, accused of harboring forbidden texts. He's brought before the inquisitors, silent, sullen. They ask. He says nothing. They ask again. Nothing. Then they produce the tickler. Still nothing. So they begin. They secure his arm, exposed to the torchlight, and press the claw against his skin, not to strike, but to let him feel the pressure. Then a scrape, not a slash, just a drag. Flesh rises like a wave beneath the prongs. Not blood yet, just the suggestion of blood. But by the second scrape, it opens, and he opens too. They're under the floorboards, he says, voice shaking. Confession offered not to avoid more pain, but to avoid becoming less. What's oddly disturbing is how this tool was held. It wasn't swung like a whip or smashed like a hammer. It was used gently, with control, like someone carving meat, slowly and with care. It's this precision that makes it worse. The tickler didn't cause chaos. It caused orderly suffering. It had intent. That's what your mind returns to again and again, the idea that someone chose every stroke, every angle, every place to press. You weren't flayed at random. You were flayed strategically. A lesser known and rather unsettling fringe theory suggests that some versions of the tickler were deliberately blunted, designed not to penetrate deeply but to drag the upper layers of skin slowly off the body. The goal wasn't blood, it was exposure. Layers peeled away to reveal pink, shining nerve endings. The victim wouldn't bleed out. They'd remain conscious, lucid, coherent, perfect for further questioning, like a painting that isn't finished until it starts to scream. There's no hard evidence for this specific variation, just hints in certain trial records that mention tools that cause skin to flee the body, whatever that means. but it fits the larger pattern pain not as climax, but as method. You can't help but wonder who made the first one. Did a blacksmith feel pride in its balance? Did they test it on wood first, or something more forgiving? And did the person who used it ever dream about the sound, that quiet tear, like wet fabric? It's not loud, it's not even fast, but it stays with you, even now, sitting in your bed, in the safety of modern life. You can almost hear it. That's what a good torture device does. It lives in your imagination longer than it ever lived in reality. There are accounts, too, of ticklers used not just on limbs, but on the face, eyelids, lips. These are debated. Of course, no one agrees whether such specific punishments were real or mythologized. Some say they were exaggerations meant to demonize the Inquisition. Others insist they happened more than we want to believe. The truth. It likely depends on the region, the judge, and the level of desperation in the room. After all, torture wasn't just about extracting information, it was about displaying dominance. A trial could be theater. The tickler was its prop. And when it was used, the aftermath mattered. The victim didn't walk away anonymously. They carried the damage into the town square, into their homes, their families. People would look at them differently. A flayed arm, a ravaged cheek that told a story louder than any testimony. And that was the point. Torture didn't always happen in public, but its results were always meant to be seen. Pain, as medieval society understood it, was part punishment and part communication. What was done to one body spoke to all bodies. A mainstream legal fact, often buried under the drama, is that in many systems, torture was officially illegal unless approved by a judge. And even then, specific tools were sanctioned while others were forbidden. The Spanish tickler existed in a gray zone. It wasn't banned in most territories, but neither was it encouraged. It was used when the accused was seen as especially dangerous, or when fear needed to be re-established. Think of it as the final warning, before the fire, before the execution, before they gave up on you entirely. Even the name feels misleading. Tickler, as if it were a joke, as if it teased you. But perhaps that was part of its horror. The name disarms you, lulls you into thinking it's less than it is. That's how cruelty works best when it wears a grin, when it pretends to be playful. But there's nothing playful here. Just 4 claws, a grip, and a memory. You leave the chamber in your mind, but the tickler stays. It's not dramatic enough to be infamous, not large enough to dominate the space, but it lingers. Not like a wound, like a whisper, the kind that returns when your hands are still and the room is quiet. That's its real function. Not to flay you once, but to haunt you forever. Water. That's the next tool. Not spikes, not fire, not blades, just water. You'd think it would be harmless, almost soothing, a cleansing element, something soft, something pure. But in medieval hands, water became a weapon of exquisite subtlety, one that didn't tear flesh or leave obvious marks, but instead worked beneath the skin, inside the mind, down where reason sleeps and panic begins to wake. You're brought into a chamber that smells of mildew and wet stone, where your feet leave slight prints behind you. And somewhere in the darkness, a slow, steady drip echoes from above. This is water torture, and it doesn't come in one neat category. It's a whole family of methods: dripping, dunking, simulated drowning, and each one is a lesson in how something gentle can become unbearable. You start with the drip, the classic, a single drop of water, falling onto your forehead at perfectly timed intervals every few seconds, sometimes longer. It doesn't hurt, not at first. You even laugh, maybe, when they tie you down and let the first drop fall. It's just water, after all. A slight chill, a tickle. But then time starts stretching. Your muscles cramp. Your skin feels every drop as a small surprise, an unwelcome visitor that never knocks. The randomness becomes rhythm. Then the rhythm becomes madness. You can't move. You can't wipe it away. You lie there, still and exposed. And your brain, poor thing, starts to expect the drop, starts to dread the drop. starts to hallucinate the drop even when it's not falling. This was the genius behind the technique. It wasn't the drop that tortured you. It was the space between drops, that pregnant silence filled with tension, with the knowledge that it's coming again, over and over and over. Historians still debate whether the infamous drip method was truly used in medieval Europe or whether it came later. A Renaissance flourish. Some claim it originated in Italy, others in Spain. What is known is that by the early modern period, it was widely referenced, often as a metaphor for relentless suffering, the kind of torture that didn't draw blood, just unspooled sanity like a loose thread. A mainstream historical fact is that the technique was eventually refined and applied during interrogations in later centuries, including during the Spanish Inquisition and even into the early days of modern policing in some places. But its medieval roots remain foggy, half hidden behind damp manuscripts and secondhand reports. If the drip was slow madness, then dunking was its louder cousin. It involves strapping the accused to a plank or frame and repeatedly immersing them into water, usually a river, sometimes a barrel, even a trough. You'd be pulled under, held for a few seconds, then hauled up sputtering, only to go back down again. The goal wasn't drowning, not entirely. It was confusion, disorientation. Sometimes the accused was blindfolded. Other times, they were spun beforehand. The body doesn't know how to process repeated near-death experiences. It starts to panic before the water even touches the skin. That anticipation again. That raw, fraying fear of the next dunk. Then there's simulated drowning, what we now call waterboarding. It has ancient roots, and although the exact version we know today wasn't common in the Middle Ages, its principles existed. A cloth placed over the mouth and nose. Water poured slowly. The victim feels as though they are suffocating, but they aren't. Not entirely. They can breathe just enough to survive, just enough to scream, but not enough to stop the overwhelming feeling that death is seconds away, again and again. What makes this technique especially cruel is its invisibility. Afterward, the body looks fine. No bruises, no cuts, but inside the terror lingers like a stain on the soul. One fringe theory posits that water torture wasn't always about confession. Sometimes it was punishment, a symbolic purification. Drown the sin, leave the sinner. Some courts, especially in religious regions, considered water sacred, so submerging someone wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. They weren't torturing you. They claimed they were cleansing you. That's perhaps the most chilling part, pain disguised as redemption. You imagine yourself tied to the board now, rope slick with moisture, the rough edge of the cloth pressing against your face. The first splash comes, cold, sharp, your nose burns. You try to breathe and fail. You panic, jerk against the ropes, try to tilt your head. A second splash, a third, you start to cough. They stop, let you gasp, then begin again. It's a rhythm, one they've practiced, one they know works. And as the cycle repeats, you forget what dry air even feels like. Your chest heaves, your legs tremble. You would say anything now, anything, just to hear the sound of a room without water. A mainstream legal detail that often surprises people is that some forms of water torture were technically illegal even in medieval times. That's right, some courts had banned them, not because they were inhumane, but because they were too effective. The logic went like this: if a technique could extract a confession from anyone, guilty or not, then it was unreliable. Clever. Right. Torture that's too good becomes useless. So water, in all its forms, hovered in a legal gray area used discreetly, or justified under exceptional circumstances. You weren't supposed to use it, but everyone knew someone who did. The records, when they exist, are sparse and unsettling. A scribe noting subject immersed 4 times revealed names after second. Another writes, victim spoke falsehoods, under pressure confession retracted. It's all there, behind the ink. If you know how to read between the lines, pain is rarely described directly. It's hinted at, implied, like shame or drowning. You walk out of the chamber dripping in thoughts you can't shake. You dry off, but the sense of weight doesn't leave. Water is supposed to cleanse, supposed to heal. But here, it's been inverted, turned into a force of forgetting, a tool that doesn't break the body, only unmoors it. And that's the essence of this form of torture, not injury, but disconnection. You don't emerge as yourself. You emerge washed of yourself, like a page left out in the rain. And the worst part, there's no sound more mocking than a drip in the silence. No torment more efficient than the thing you need water, becoming the thing that undoes you. You sip it every day. You wash with it. You trust it. But in the dark corners of history, water learned how to wait, how to wear you down one drop at a time. It doesn't cut, it erases. There's a wheel in the center of the square, wooden, worn, larger than it seems from a distance, and unnervingly ordinary, like something that might once have belonged to a cart, or perhaps a piece of farm equipment. It has spokes, a central axle, and the faint memory of usefulness, but now it's been repurposed, claimed by ritual. This is the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, and it doesn't roll anymore. It stays still, because what happens on it is meant to be seen. This isn't a device tucked into a chamber. This is public, loud, designed for an audience, and you're part of it now. The wheel's true function was never transportation. It was transformation, from body to spectacle, from person to warning. And as you step closer in your imagination, you can almost feel the breath of the crowd around you silent, tense, not out of compassion but anticipation. They're not here for justice, they're here for the moment. The condemned is brought forth arms tied, legs shaking, sometimes naked, sometimes clothed. They are bound to the wheel in different ways depending on the region, the crime, and the mood of the executioner. In some cases, the victim is lashed across it like a crucifix, limbs aligned with the spokes. In others, they are tied beneath it, laid out so the wheel can be turned upon them. But always, the structure is the same: wood, ropes, and iron bars. The bars are key, because it is not the wheel alone that breaks the body. It's the iron rod wielded by the executioner, crashing down with practiced, deliberate rhythm onto bones that are exposed, helpless, and waiting. One blow at the shin, one at the thigh, the arm, the ribs. The pattern is precise. There were often instructions to follow, codified rhythms of destruction to ensure the spectacle was orderly. The limbs are broken at multiple points, but not in ways that kill quickly. That's the trick. The bones are shattered in place, sometimes twisted between spokes, but the organs are preserved. The heart, the lungs, the brain all left intact, because death must not come yet. The body is not the only thing being broken here. It's the idea of resistance, the idea that anything other than obedience leads to this. A mainstream historical fact is that breaking on the wheel was used across Europe well into the 18th century, though its roots go back further. France, Germany, the Low Countries each had variations. In some places, the victim was executed first, then broken posthumously for display. In others, the breaking was the execution, stretched out over hours, sometimes longer. In certain towns, the executioner would deliver what was called the coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or neck, a mercy killing granted only after enough suffering had been rendered for public satisfaction. The crowd came for pain, but even they had limits. Sometimes, there's a lesser-known detail often missed in retellings: the way the wheel was displayed after the execution. The body, shattered and often unrecognizable, would be left tied to it and hoisted on a pole. There it would remain days, weeks, its shape warped by death and weather, visited by crows, stared at by children. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a reminder, a billboard for obedience. And even when the corpse finally gave way to time, the wheel stayed, sometimes bleached by the sun, sometimes stained dark with age. It stood as a kind of secular relic. You didn't need a sermon, you just needed to see it. Historians still argue whether the wheel was designed for maximal pain or maximal message. Was the executioner trying to cause suffering, or simply display it? Was the purpose to draw out the death, or to mark it publicly as a kind of civic cleansing? The truth is, of course, both. The line between punishment and performance was so blurred that often the two became indistinguishable. The wheel wasn't just a tool, it was a stage. You imagine lying on it now, your arms splayed, your breath shallow. The executioner stands above you, holding the bar. He isn't cruel. He isn't angry. He's simply doing his job. That's what makes it worse. There's no malice-only process. The first blow comes, it's fast, shocking. Then another, and another. You don't scream right away. The pain is too large for that. Your voice is still trying to understand it. The bones give way before the voice does. And then, when it comes, it's not a scream. It's a sound that doesn't belong to you anymore. In some towns, this execution was reserved for the worst crimes: murder, regicide, betrayal. In others, it was more flexible. A thief, if unlucky, might find himself offered to the wheel. A heretic, a woman accused of poisoning her husband. The criteria varied, but the principle was constant. Some crimes couldn't be answered with a rope or a blade. They had to be broken publicly, visibly, irreversibly. And in doing so, the community itself reaffirmed its order. Pain as ritual, death as declaration. A quirky fringe tidbit in one documented execution from the 1600s. The condemned man reportedly survived for nearly 2 days tied to the wheel. He was given water, bread, even comforted by a priest. Not because anyone wanted him to live, but because his lingering death was seen as divinely significant. A holy suffering, something worth witnessing. He didn't scream after the first day. He just stared, unblinking. The townspeople came and went, bringing their children, pointing to the body. This, they told them, is what happens when you break the rules. And maybe that's the final horror. Not the breaking, but the watching. Because no one turned away. The wheel was meant to be seen. Its creaks were heard from windows. Its silhouette haunted hillsides. And in its center, the broken body became more than human. It became law. The moment your bones give up, your image becomes a symbol. And symbols are more powerful than screams. You leave the wheel now, or try to, but you hear it still. A wooden circle that doesn't turn. A tool that stays still and demands the world rotate around it. The groan of the timber, the hush of the audience, the dull thud of bone meeting iron. These are the sounds history forgets to record, but they linger. And maybe, in some corner of your mind, they always will. They walk you next to something angular and cruelly elegant. A pyramid of polished wood, tall and narrow, gleaming slightly as if someone had oiled it not long ago. At first glance, it looks like an abstract sculpture, a geometric joke in the wrong room. Then you notice the leather straps bolted into the floor around it, and the winch above. Your throat tightens. This is the Judas cradle. The name alone is bitter on the tongue. A cradle, but not for rest. A Judas, but not a man. You imagine what it demands of the body. The victim is suspended by ropes, often naked, sometimes blindfolded, then slowly lowered, groin first, onto the pointed apex of the pyramid. The tip is blunt, not sharp enough to cut immediately, but narrow enough to push deep, over time, with the full weight of the body bearing down on that single point. And it doesn't stop. The descent is slow, gravity is patient, the pain isn't explosive, it's suffocating. It radiates upward from a place no one wants to imagine. And that's precisely the point. This device wasn't just about pain, it was about shame. What sets the Judas cradle apart is the intimacy of its violence. Unlike the wheel or the rack, there's no one swinging a hammer or turning a crank with visible force. The executioner barely needs to act. He just lowers the rope gradually, perhaps with a quiet breath, perhaps while reciting a prayer, and the body does the rest. Your muscles betray you, your spine curves, your thighs quake, the point presses in. It doesn't cut. Not yet it parts. And beneath the humiliation, a different horror takes shape, the sense that you're cooperating with your own torment. That gravity and ordinary, passive force is now your enemy. You try to hold yourself aloft. You fail, again and again, until you're not resisting anymore, just existing. Barely. A mainstream historical fact is that the Judas cradle is widely attributed to Italian and Spanish inquisitorial courts in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. Though hard records are scarce, Most of what we know about it comes from 17th century accounts and scattered illustrations, many of which may have been embellished or copied from earlier exaggerations. Historians still argue whether the device was used regularly or simply imagined and described as part of a torture mythology. Some suggest the idea of such a device was too grotesque to be fabricated. No one could make that up, they claim. Others argue the opposite, that the very extremity of the design reveals its likely fictional status, born of fear and rumor. Still, replicas exist in museums. Schematics are sketched in old manuals. Whether real or not, it has the texture of truth. There's a fringe theory that the pyramid tip was sometimes intentionally dull, specifically to delay penetration and maximize fear. The point wasn't to impale the victim in one motion, it was to threaten the impalement endlessly. Just enough pressure to bruise. To tear slowly, hours could pass. Sometimes a day, sometimes longer, and if the confession didn't come, the ropes would lower another inch. Not dramatically, just a breath of descent. And in that small movement, everything inside the victim unraveled. What makes the cradle so horrifying, even among this parade of devices, is its design of isolation. It turns the victim inward. There's no grand public stage, no crowd roaring for punishment, just you, the device, and the silence between breaths. The body tightens, the pain blooms, but it's the humiliation that truly breaks you. The violation of dignity, the mockery of stability. You weren't just tortured, you were displayed in the most vulnerable, shameful position imaginable, held aloft by your own weight, pierced by your own presence. The device needed no torture master. The laws of nature did the work. There's something almost symbolic about the pyramid itself, a shape that reaches upward but begins at a painful point. It resembles sacred geometry used in cathedrals, temples, monuments, and yet here, it's turned inward. Not an ascent, but a descent into pain, into self. And if you were religious, which many victims were, you'd be told this pain was divine justice, that your suffering had purpose, that every tear was a tithe to truth. It's spiritual gaslighting in iron and wood, and you believed it, or pretended to, because the alternative was silence, and the cradle hated silence. In some reports, the victim was not killed but merely broken, released after hours or days, body damaged, soul shredded. The internal injuries were often hidden tears, ruptures, infections that festered out of view. But the limp, the haunted eyes, the flinching at shadows, those told the rest of the story. This wasn't a tool for execution. It was a tool for memory. You didn't forget the cradle. Not ever. It followed you, lived in your posture, in the way you sat, in the way you spoke softer afterward. One chilling anecdote tells of a merchant accused of forging ecclesiastical records. He denied it, repeatedly, proudly, until the ropes began to lower. He confessed within minutes, but the priest in charge claimed his voice lacked sincerity. They waited. An hour passed, then another. By the third hour, the merchant begged for absolution, not for the crime, but for doubting the court's authority. That's how deep the cradle reached. Not into flesh, but into belief. The name itself, Judas Cradle, suggests betrayal. But whose Judas betrayed Christ? Yes. But the victim, in this case, betrays themselves. Their voice, their resistance, their faith. It's a cradle of inversion. You enter one person, you emerge, if you emerge at all, as someone else entirely. Someone who has touched a place they didn't know existed, who has been touched by that place. A mainstream legal nuance, the church, contrary to popular belief, often claimed to oppose torture, at least in official doctrine, but it made exceptions. Many. If the accused was deemed dangerous enough, or the sin severe enough, or the confession urgent enough, then the rules bent. And where the rules bent, the cradle waited, silently, just out of view, its base polished, its point steady. And yet, for all its terror, the Judas Cradle wasn't the most commonly used tool. It lacked the portability of thumbscrews, the spectacle of the wheel, the bureaucratic simplicity of the chair. It required space, time, setup, and someone with a steady hand. But that rarity made it more feared, like a secret weapon. Whispers about it were enough. You didn't have to see it. You just had to know it might be waiting. You stand over it now, in your mind. Looking down, the pyramid waits, still, almost elegant. And you realize something it doesn't need to be proven real to feel true. The terror it represents the violation, the helplessness, the way pain can be slow, silent, a spiritual that terror is very real. Whether someone once sat upon this cradle or merely imagined they might, the effect is the same. A body flinching centuries later, a breath caught in a throat that never felt the rope. You leave the cradle, but it does not leave you. Now the room changes. Not in shape, not in structure, but in temperature. The air grows thicker, warmer. You smell soot, something metallic and sweet, like scorched coins. And in the center of the stone floor sits something unmistakably foreign, ancient in design, mythic in reputation. It gleams with a bronze sheen, shaped like a hollowed bull, lying on its side as if in mid-rest. But the eyes are empty, the mouth is open, and inside that gaping cavity is a chamber just large enough for a person. You've reached the brazen bull, perhaps the most theatrical torture device ever imagined. Though its origins trace back to ancient Greece, it was resurrected in the medieval imagination with new intensity passed from myth into whispered memory. From sculpture to supposed sentence, you step closer. The beast's mouth is frozen mid-roar, and it dawns on you why. This wasn't just a torture tool, it was a performance. It had to be. The legend goes like this: a tyrant king, Phalaris of Agrigentum, is presented with this terrible invention by its designer, a man named Perillos, a bull forged of bronze, hollowed and fitted with a door on one side. A person would be locked inside, then a fire lit beneath the belly. The metal would heat gradually, roasting the victim alive. But here's the flourish tubes and pipes were arranged so that the victim's screams would echo out of the bull's mouth, like a beast bellowing in fury. Pain converted into theater, agony made musical. That was the innovation, a symphony of horror. Supposedly, the first man to test it was the inventor himself, thrown inside by the very tyrant he sought to impress. Whether this ever happened is another question entirely. Historians still argue if the brazen bull was real or entirely mythical, but its idea has persisted, passed from empire to empire, generation to generation, until by the Middle Ages, it had become more than legend, it had become a symbol. Medieval Europe adored such symbols. Devices like the Iron Maiden or the wheel didn't need to be used often, they just had to exist. The brazen bull was rarer, of course, a product of enormous effort and cost, but that only made it more potent. The few who claimed to possess won noble houses, inquisitorial courts, exotic collectors wielded it like a psychological weapon. Confess, they might say, or face the bull. And the mind, being fragile, didn't need confirmation that it worked. It just needed imagination. Pain that could be heard roaring through a beast's mouth. That's the kind of terror that sticks to the ribs. A mainstream historical fact is that there's no reliable medieval documentation of the brazen bull being constructed or used during that period, despite numerous references in literature and later museum displays. Most surviving brazen bulls are reconstructions, speculative sculptures made centuries after the supposed original, and yet, it shows up in texts, in art, in sermons. A figure of justice gone monstrous, a punishment so total, so enveloping, that even death becomes a chorus. You stand now beside it. The body of the bull is seamless. The metal has no visible bolts or joins. It feels alive in its stillness. The nostrils are wide, the mouth agape. Inside, you imagine the walls heating slowly, like a pot left too long on the fire. At first, it's uncomfortable, then unbearable, then unspeakable. But the real horror comes not from the heat. It comes from the echo, because the bull was designed to trap sound, to filter it, to amplify it. Your scream would be reshaped, twisted, turned animal. No one would hear you. They'd hear it. That's what makes the brazen bull so cruel. It doesn't just burn you. It consumes you, transforms your voice into its own. You're not just dying. You're being translated, taken out of your body and reimagined as noise, a warning, a grotesque opera. The audience doesn't have to see you writhe. They just listen, and the bull sings for you. There's a fringe theory that some medieval courts used smaller versions of the bull not for execution, but for demonstration. They would heat it slightly, place a criminal inside just long enough to cause discomfort, then open the door with a dramatic hiss. The point wasn't to harm, it was to show, to prove that the court had the power, the tool, the willingness. Whether or not the heat scorched the flesh didn't matter. What mattered was the myth being kept alive. The idea that pain could speak for itself. In a way, the brazen bull is the ancestor of modern propaganda. It wasn't built to be practical. It was built to be believed. Even its design feels theatrical. A beast that roars human agony. A sculpture that doubles as a tomb. It's performance art for the darkest parts of the human soul. And while scholars debate its historical authenticity, no one doubts its cultural power. You say the name Brazen Bull and people know. They recoil, they whisper, because we understand, instinctively, what it means to burn and not be heard. The irony, of course, is that fire is the most ancient of tortures. Long before devices, before law, before prisons, there was fire. But here, it's refined, masked, disguised as bronze beauty. The bull is majestic, almost divine. And that's the final insult. You die inside something beautiful. Your end is wrapped in art. You imagine being led to it, stripped, bound. The door creaks open. The interior is narrow, lined with metal ribs. You climb inside, or are shoved. The door closes, darkness, then light beneath you, then heat. Your fingers twitch, your skin tightens. The metal hums. You scream, and the scream doesn't sound like you. It never will again. A mainstream cultural fact is that later periods, particularly during the Enlightenment, used the myth of the brazen bull as a symbol of tyrannical excess. It became shorthand for cruelty disguised as order, for pain engineered to look noble. In that sense, it outlived its own myth. Even if it never burned a body, it burned itself into the conscience of Europe. And you wonder, as you step away from the silent beast, whether any torture device is ever truly about the victim. Maybe it's about the audience, the listener, the person who walks past the bull and thinks, I should behave. Maybe the fire was never meant to kill. Maybe it was meant to teach, to brand the idea that power can burn you in ways no wound will show. You glance back once more. The bull does not move. It does not roar. But you hear it anyway, in the hush of the chamber, in the quiet shiver of your ribs, in the memory of a scream you never made, but still somehow recognize. You find yourself somewhere quieter now, but somehow colder too, not in temperature, but in tone. A different kind of cruelty lives here. There are no racks, no wheels, no bulls, just shelves lined with iron masks, hanging like forgotten puppets. Each one bears a grotesque face, elongated noses, drooping ears, twisted mouths stretched into permanent jeers. Some are shaped like animals, pigs, donkeys, even dogs. You instinctively step back, but their stares follow. These are shame masks, and their function wasn't to maim, but to mock. They weren't made to break bones, they were made to break spirits. And unlike many of the other devices you've seen so far, these weren't hidden away in chambers. These were worn outside, in the streets, among the very people you once lived beside, and that made them devastating in a completely different way. The process was simple. You were accused, not always convicted of a minor offense. Maybe gossip, maybe gluttony, maybe simple disobedience, nothing that warranted death, but enough to demand correction. And so they brought out the mask. Each one was tailored not to your face, but to your crime. Speak too much. They strapped on a mask with a long metal tongue, sometimes spiked, pressing down your throat. Act like a beast. You got the pig snout, the dog muzzle, the donkey ears, and then they paraded you, not behind closed doors, but through the town square. Children pointed, adults laughed, and your friends, well, they looked away. That might have been the worst part. One mainstream historical fact is that shame punishments like these were especially popular in German-speaking regions, and parts of France during the late medieval and early modern periods. There, the idea of public moral order was deeply entwined with social control. The masks were part of a wider culture of civic discipline stocks, pillories, public whippings, all designed to remind citizens where they stood in the hierarchy. Pain wasn't always necessary. Sometimes humiliation did the job better. And these masks, they humiliated perfectly. You picture one now, an iron face with bulging eyes and a grin like broken pottery. The inside is worse than the outside. Rusted edges scrape your skin. The mask is heavy, pressing down on your neck. Breathing is difficult. Speaking is impossible. And your peripheral vision is gone. You don't walk, you stumble. And all the while, the townspeople look. Some laugh, some whisper. A few pretend not to notice, but no one helps. Because this is the point, not just to punish, but to separate. You're no longer one of them. You are othered, visibly, physically, and completely. Historians still argue whether some of the more elaborate mask designs were ever used, or merely created for display and symbolism. There are records of masks with bells attached, so that each movement announced the wearer's shame. Others had mouthpieces that forced the tongue into unnatural positions, causing drooling and choking. Were these really worn, or were they warnings? Some say yes, others suspect exaggeration. But one thing is clear, these masks weren't built for comfort. They weren't just punitive, they were theatrical. You didn't wear the mask to be forgotten. You wore it to be remembered. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit. Some cities had mask libraries collections stored by local magistrates who assigned them like grim props. You commit a crime, and they pick a face for you. Yes. The liar's snout. Haven't used this one since February. It sounds absurd, comical, until you imagine the reality, a woman walking past the bakery, her head weighed down by a laughing goat's mask, not screaming, just walking, hoping no one recognizes her gait. But, of course, they do, because everyone knows who she is. That's the purpose. These punishments weren't about one person. They were about the crowd, the community, the message, and sometimes, even when the mask came off, the shame didn't. People remembered. The iron was gone, but the face lingered in stories, in nicknames, in glances that never quite met your eyes again. It was a sentence without end. A punishment that lived on in memory. There's also the question of who enforced these rituals. Often it wasn't a priest or a judge or a soldier, it was the neighbors. The mask was put on, and the crowd did the rest. Mockery became a civic duty. You imagine it, the jeering, the chants, the rotted fruit flung from windows. Not because people hated you, but because they feared becoming you. The mask created not just a spectacle, but a boundary. And everyone watching knew exactly which side of it they wanted to stay on. And what of the accused? Not all were guilty. Some were scapegoats, women especially, gossip, insubordination. Dressing immodestly, these were common charges, easy targets. If a woman spoke too freely or too often, the brank came out. That's another name for it, the scold's bridle. A shame mask fitted with a tongue clamp or plate, designed to prevent speech entirely. The plate pressed down, heavy and sharp, scraping the mouth until silence wasn't just desired, it was necessary. It wasn't enough to silence someone. They had to wear their silence. A mainstream cultural fact, many of these masks have survived. You can see them today in museums Vienna, Nuremberg, Paris resting quietly behind glass. Some even have documentation beside them who wore them. Why? For how long? And yet, when you look at them, it's hard to believe they were ever real. They feel theatrical, ridiculous, until you imagine you wearing one. Until you remember how small towns can be, how fast stories spread, how easy it is to become the subject of laughter. That's when they stop looking theatrical and start looking inevitable. There's a fringe theory that shame masks were also used internally, within cloisters or schools, where they became tools of discipline rather than public humiliation. A novice monk caught daydreaming might wear a donkey mask in solitude. A student who failed a catechism might wear a fool's cap with iron ears. These uses were never recorded officially, but they live in whispers, in marginal notes, in paintings that seem oddly humorous until you realize what they depict. A classroom, a child, A mask? You stand now in front of a particularly cruel design, one shaped like a rooster, with a beak that juts forward and a comb that curls back in iron spikes. You imagine it on your head. The heat, the pressure, the way your breathing echoes back into your skull. It's not pain. Not exactly. It's the absence of humanity. The feeling of becoming caricature. A walking joke that no one wants to touch. You might survive this. You might even laugh about it one day. But you won't be the same. Something is lost when a face becomes a mask. And that is the real legacy of these devices. Not the bruises or the cuts, but the erasure. The way they rewrite identity, transform people into stories, symbols, warnings. You leave the room with the iron faces watching you go, and somehow, their silence feels louder than any scream. The fire crackles again. Not from a hearth, but from bundles of wood piled deliberately beneath a raised wooden stake. You've wandered into a darker square now, one built more for ritual than punishment, and the air carries a scent of ash that isn't entirely from this century. This is where the witches burned. Not all of them, of course. Some were drowned, some merely tortured. But when the sentence was final, when the confession had been wrung out and the fear had been properly distributed, the pyre became the finale. You picture it now, a woman tied to the post, not screaming but staring. As the kindling is lit, she doesn't die instantly. That's part of it. Fire is slow, especially when damp wood is used, and it often was, not for sadism, but for cost. You see, heresy was expensive business. Even execution had a budget, and this was called justice. The history of witch burning is tangled and often misunderstood. A mainstream historical fact is that while the peak of witch trials occurred during the early modern period, the seeds were sown much earlier, particularly in late medieval Europe. The 13th century saw the beginnings of formalized heresy prosecution. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it bloomed into hysteria, and torture played a central role, not to punish, but to prove, because witches, you see, were slippery. They could lie, they could curse, they could transform. So the only reliable method of truth extraction was pain. Confession under torture wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Without it, the trial felt incomplete. Imagine the process. A woman, sometimes a man, but more often a woman is accused. Maybe she spoke too freely. Maybe she owned a black cat. Maybe her neighbor's cow died after an argument. Whatever the reason, suspicion blooms. The magistrates summon her. They ask the usual questions. She denies them. The records show that most accused witches denied everything at first. That's when the tools came out. The rack, the strappado, the chair, not to punish, not yet, just to persuade, to remind. The questions continue. The answers weaken. Eventually, the name comes, a demon, a spell, a confession. However fractured, the trial proceeds. The execution date is set. But here's the truly medieval twist. The execution wasn't just punishment, it was purification. The fire wasn't there to destroy. It was there to cleanse. You weren't being killed. You were being saved. That was the church's position. The body perished. Yes, but the soul. The soul had a chance. The fire burned away sin. And that narrative, so strangely merciful, so horrifyingly serene, was what allowed so many to watch without guilt. They weren't witnessing murder. They were witnessing redemption. There's a fringe theory that some inquisitors believed the act of burning itself could release demons from the possessed, that the heat not only punished the witch, but drove the devil back to hell. In this light, the pyre becomes a kind of inverted baptism. Instead of water, fire. Instead of life, death. But in both, a transformation. You leave the world different than you entered. The crowd watches not with hatred, always, but with fear. Superstition fed on spectacle. And here's the thing that often gets lost: not every burning was preceded by torture, but almost all were justified by it. That's the deeper damage. Torture provided the script, the confession, the names of accomplices, the rituals, the Sabbaths, and once those words were written down, they became part of the record. The fire didn't erase them. It validated them. Even if the accused recanted later, Even if the testimony changed, the parchment didn't. The story stayed. The sentence stood. A mainstream cultural fact is that much of what we associate with witchcraft, the flying, the cauldrons, the pacts with Satan, was shaped by confessions obtained under torture. When someone is hanging by their wrists with their shoulders dislocated, they'll say what they're asked to say, and inquisitors often brought suggestions. Did you fly? Did you kiss the devil? Did you cause the harvest to fail? And the accused, exhausted and broken, agreed. Those stories entered the books. From there, they became doctrine, and from doctrine, folklore. Torture didn't just punish witches, it invented them. You walk now through a burned-out square. The fire is gone, but the smell lingers imagined. Perhaps, but strong. You see ghosts of rope, ashes swirling, a blackened post, and behind it all, the bureaucracy, the scribes, the court officials, the city guards. They aren't monsters. They're professionals. They're following steps. The accusation, the interrogation, the proof, the sentence. No one wants to be the villain. But the system doesn't care about desire, only execution. A quirky footnote: some cities required families to pay for the execution. Wood, rope, fuel, all invoiced. If the condemned had property, it was seized to cover costs. If not, their kin were billed. In death, you owed the state one last debt. And the fire, ravenous and thorough, consumed everything except the paperwork. That part survived. And what of those who watched the townspeople, the neighbors, the children? They learned, not just to fear witches, but to fear being accused. They learned silence, conformity. Some prayed, others gossiped, most moved on. But they remembered. You don't forget a person burning. You don't forget the scream that turns into smoke. Historians still argue about the exact number of people executed as witches during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds. But what's more important than the count is the mechanism, the process, the way belief and pain merged into truth. A confession under torture wasn't just admissible, it was sacred. And so the cycle continued: accusation, torture, confession, execution, and silence. You picture the last moments now. The crowd gathered, the condemned tied to the stake. Maybe a priest offers words. Maybe a friend cries. The torch touches the wood. The flame rises. At first, there's coughing, then shouting, then a silence too big to be comfortable. It lasts longer than it should, long enough for everyone to think, this could have been me. And maybe that's the most effective torture of all: the knowledge that guilt was flexible, that innocence wasn't enough, and that the line between accuser and accused could shift with a whisper. You leave the square, you try not to turn around, but the warmth on your back isn't comforting. It's warning. The echoes of the pyre fade as you step into the wide open space of a medieval town. Square, a place that should feel safer, more familiar. There's market chatter in your mind. Imagine footsteps, vendors calling, the creak of carts rolling over uneven stones. But today, there's no market. Just a wooden scaffold, slightly elevated, and a structure beside it, the pillory, or perhaps the stocks. It doesn't matter. Both serve the same purpose, not to torture in secret, but to punish in plain sight. Because here, in this space between commerce and worship, pain wasn't hidden, it was performed. You were displayed, not for the sake of justice, but for the sake of the crowd. Civic theater, an open-air morality tale, and the role of the accused was both simple and inescapable. Become the lesson. The town square was more than a physical location. It was the social engine. It's where deals were made, news exchanged, alliances hinted at. But when someone was sentenced to public punishment, the entire rhythm of the town shifted. Bread could wait, gossip could pause. Everyone came to see. And you, in your mind, are there now watching as the latest culprit is led forward. The offense, stealing bread, or maybe blasphemy, or failing to pay a tax. Again, it doesn't matter. The pillory awaits, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. Once locked in, you stand or stoop, unable to move, entirely at the mercy of the watching world. And they do watch. Some jeer, some pray, Others simply stare. The idea was never to destroy the body. That was for other places. Here, they destroyed reputation, a slow, public decay of dignity, done not with iron but with attention. You can feel it now, the itch behind your neck, the weight of every eye. Someone spits, someone laughs, a child throws rotten vegetables. You blink against the sting, you can't wipe it away, you can't speak, you can't leave. Time thickens. A mainstream historical fact is that public punishments like pillories, whipping posts, and cucking stools were deeply woven into the legal systems of medieval Europe, especially in towns with growing bureaucracies and shrinking tolerance for disorder. The punishments were brief, but the memory lasted. In some regions, they were scheduled events posted on notice boards like plays or sermons, and people attended, not as bystanders, but as participants. The public was expected to react, to judge, to mock, to approve. This was collective morality enacted in real time. The theatricality extended beyond mere punishment. Executioners and town criers developed scripts. Accusations were read aloud with flair. Sometimes the accused were forced to repeat their crimes. Costumes were added, hats with donkey ears, tunics painted with lies. The body became a stage. The crime became a monologue. And the townspeople, whether they clapped or turned away, always remembered the scene. Memory was the real sentence. There's a fringe theory that the spectacle wasn't just to punish the accused, but to give the crowd something to agree on. In a world without mass media, without screens, the square was the theater, the courtroom, the forum. Seeing someone locked in a pillory gave people a brief, delicious unity. At least I'm not them, they thought. That thought, soft, fleeting, was the price of order. Sometimes it escalated. A thief might be whipped while in the pillory. The lashing wasn't the worst part, it was the noise, the rhythm of the whip, the absence of rescue, and after it ended, they were left there raw, dripping, humiliated. The punishment didn't stop with the pain. It continued with the sun, the flies, the whispering, and the stares that never softened. But not all were passive observers. Some crowds took their role further. They threw stones, urine, dead animals. There were cases where people died in the pillory, not from the sentence itself, but from the crowd's enthusiasm. Those deaths were not always punished, because, as some officials reasoned, the people must release their anger. That's what made it theater, not law. The script could change mid-performance. You imagine a man now headlocked, arms limp, face swollen from a thrown apple. He's not a criminal, not really, just unlucky, or poor, or caught in the wrong lie. His eyes meet yours. For a moment, you wonder what you'd do in that crowd. Would you throw something too? Would you turn away, or worse, would you stare without blinking, just to make sure you remember? A mainstream legal nuance is that time spent in the pillory varied by region, crime, and status. A nobleman might endure an hour, a peasant, a day, but even 10 minutes could mark you for life, because this wasn't about how long you suffered. It was about how long others saw you suffer. And people remember what they watch, especially when they're told they're allowed to enjoy it. There's also the soundscape, the crier's voice booming the sentence, the murmurs of the crowd, the occasional song, if the case was especially scandalous. Medieval towns turned shame into chorus, pain into refrain, and later, over dinner, people would reenact the best parts. Did you see how he flinched? Did you hear her cry? They weren't being cruel. They were being connected. In a world divided by class and feudal law, public pain was common ground. A quirky detail that's often lost: some towns issued official invitations to nearby villages when a notable punishment was scheduled. It was, quite literally, an event. Vendors came, ale flowed, and the accused, trapped in wood, became part of the entertainment. You can't help but think of a festival with one rotten fruit stand set aside for justice. And yet, it worked. People behaved. Or at least, they were afraid not to. The punishment ended when the crier said so, but not for the accused. They were released, covered in waste, blinking against the sun, and then came the walk home, past the same faces, the same stones, the same whispers. That walk was its own sentence, a reverse parade, one that never ended, because long after the mask or manacles came off, the label remained. You weren't John the Miller anymore. You were John the thief, John the liar, John the man who cried. You leave the square now, stepping over the stone where the scaffold once stood. It's clean, empty, but you swear you hear something, the faint creak of wood, the hum of a crowd rehearsing its next reaction, and in that moment, it hits you. Torture isn't always private. Sometimes the sharpest pain comes not from iron, but from eyes, from being seen when you most want to disappear, from becoming a story people tell, even when your voice is no longer part of it. Now the walls grow thicker again, and the light dims. You've left the public square behind and entered the cloistered stone halls of the church, not the warm chapel of hymns and incense, but the colder side, the corridors of inquiry. This is where the Inquisition lives, not as a man, not as a single idea, but as an institution, slow, relentless, and terribly quiet. You feel the difference in the air. It doesn't shout, it waits. The Inquisition did not see itself as cruel. It saw itself as corrective, a hospital for the soul. And like all proper hospitals, it had procedures. You pass beneath an archway etched with Latin, and step into a room where everything is arranged too neatly. A table, a stool, a candle burning at half its length, and on the wall, ropes, hooks, a small basin of water. These were not torture chambers in the popular sense. These were listening rooms, places where truth was extracted not in haste, but in patience. Because when the Inquisition asked questions, it already knew the answers. It just needed you to say them. The church didn't torture to learn. It tortured to confirm. That was its brilliance and its cruelty. You weren't asked what you believed. You were told. You were shown pages of your own confession before you ever spoke. If you hesitated, that was resistance. If you agreed too quickly, that was manipulation. The truth was a narrow hallway, and you were pushed down it whether your feet moved or not. Torture here was not random. It was codified, legal. It followed rules. Canon law permitted it under certain conditions, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council. It had to be approved. It had to be witnessed. And above all, it had to be productive. Pain wasn't the punishment. It was the tool. A mainstream historical fact is that the Inquisition, particularly the Spanish and Roman branches, maintained meticulous records of their interrogations, volumes of parchment detailing not only what was asked, but how the accused responded, the emotional state, the physical reactions, sometimes even what they ate before the session. There were scribes assigned solely to record these moments. These weren't torturers in the chaotic sense. These were professionals, clerics, secretaries of suffering. Every turn of the wreck, every question whispered during strappado suspension, every confession muttered into bloodied cloth was written down. And these records survive. That's what makes this more chilling than legend. We don't have to guess. We have their notes. You picture it now, a young man accused of owning banned texts, a few sermons, maybe a letter. He denies it. The Inquisitor nods. A pause. Then he's gently asked to kneel. Ropes are fetched. The ceiling has a pulley. It always does. He's hoisted by the wrists slowly, smoothly. His shoulders lift out of their sockets with a quiet pop. He doesn't scream right away. That's not the point. The goal isn't spectacle. The goal is efficiency. The scribe dips his pen. The Inquisitor asks again, "Do you possess the writings of the Cathars?" The man says nothing. That too is written. There's a fringe theory that the Inquisition intentionally limited the violence of its tortures not out of mercy, but strategy. If someone dies, they can't recant. If someone is visibly mutilated, their confession is less credible. So the focus became psychological damage, dislocation, deprivation, sensory manipulation. One recorded technique involved keeping the accused awake for days using water drips and sudden bells, until hallucinations made truth pliable. Another method, less often discussed, involved isolation so total that time lost all meaning. Darkness, silence, a meal once per day, but always at a different hour. Your body stopped believing in clocks. Your mind followed. You think now of the Inquisitor not as a monster, but as a bureaucrat. He doesn't yell. He doesn't gloat. He simply adjusts the angle of the pulley, asks the question again and again. And when the accused finally breaks, when the voice shakes and the confession tumbles out, it's received not with glee, but with calm. Very well, the Inquisitor says. Now, tell us who else. Because torture didn't stop with a single answer. One name led to 5. 5 led to a map. The church was not hunting individuals. It was charting networks. And pain made people draw maps they couldn't even imagine. A mainstream ecclesiastical fact often overlooked is that the Inquisition was not uniform. Different regions had different standards. The Spanish Inquisition is most infamous, but it wasn't alone. In Italy, procedures were more legalistic. In France, more brutal. In the Netherlands, more erratic. But all shared a common belief that heresy was a disease, and the Inquisitor was the surgeon. You weren't being punished. You were being healed. Even if that healing left scars, even if it killed you. There's something particularly haunting about the use of moderation here. Torture was limited, time was tracked, breaks were given. You weren't tortured out of rage. You were tortured by schedule, a few minutes per session, enough to soften, not enough to destroy. You might even be examined by a church-approved physician before resuming just to ensure you could endure more. This was not chaos. It was order, pain, calibrated and precise, doled out like medicine with a very sharp spoon. You wonder what it felt like to know your torturer believed he was saving you, that each question came from duty, not hatred, that your cries were not just permitted, but expected, perhaps even necessary, because without them, how could he know the treatment was working? You weren't screaming in horror. You were screaming in progress. The Inquisitor writes another line. The clerk dries the ink. The rope creaks again. Sometimes you confessed before the torture began. That was noted. But you were still suspended, still questioned. Because if you admitted heresy so quickly, perhaps you hadn't suffered enough to truly repent. The logic curved in on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. If you resist, you are guilty. If you confess too soon, you are suspect. If you recant, you are damned. And so you hang between reason and salvation, while your wrists stretch another inch. A lesser-known detail in some trials, the Inquisitor would promise that no blood would be shed, and he'd keep that promise. The tools chosen carefully, the methods precise, bones would crack, muscles would snap, but not a drop of red. This allowed the court to claim moral superiority. We do not stain our hands. They'd say, only purify souls. It's almost impressive, in the darkest possible way. You leave the chamber now, its candle still burning low. The records remain, the names etched into parchment, the signatures shaky with pain, but signed all the same. The Inquisition didn't need to kill to win. It needed only the illusion of consent, the confession, the nod, the name. Pain was not an end. It was a method, a doctrine written in tendon and ink. And in the echo of those stone halls, you hear the soft scrape of a chair, the turn of a page, and the voice of the Inquisitor saying, "Next." Now you find yourself in a smaller room, one that doesn't creak or echo, but whispers. It smells faintly of parchment and boiled linen. This isn't a dungeon, it's an office, a chamber where things are measured and recorded, not broken and burned. The walls are lined with scrolls, with jars of ink, and shelves of tools that seem almost surgical calipers, tiny saws, scales, weighted plumbs, even something that resembles a stethoscope, though centuries too early. At first, it doesn't look like a place of torture at all, but then your eye catches the row of ropes coiled like sleeping snakes, and a thin splatter on the floor that's too brown to be wine. This is the domain of the technicians, those who were neither clergy nor guards, but legal functionaries trained in the mechanics of pain, the executioners, the notaries, the doctors. They didn't scream or threaten. They didn't pray. They prepared. This was pain as a process, and these were its administrators. Torture in medieval Europe wasn't random chaos. It was regulated. and regulation required professionals. A mainstream historical fact is that many territories, especially under Roman Catholic influence, formalized torture not just in law but in staffing. Courts hired experts who knew how to dislocate a shoulder without tearing the skin, how to stretch a limb without snapping it completely, how to keep someone conscious long enough to extract confession but not so long that they died in the middle of it. These weren't brutes. They were craftsmen, and many were proud of their precision. Some executioners passed down methods from father to son. Techniques were taught quietly, like recipes, refined over decades. The physician's role was more complicated. You imagine him now in robes of dark wool, clean hands, quiet voice. He's not here to heal. He's here to approve, to inspect the accused before the session. Are they strong enough? Can they endure 20 minutes of strappado? Or only 10? Will the body hold up under compression? Will the lungs collapse too soon? If not, the torture is postponed, adjusted, modified. It's disturbing, of course, but it's systematic. This wasn't rage. This was policy. And the lawyer, he's here too, sitting with one leg crossed, fingers steepled, watching the room like a chessboard. His job is to ensure that what happens is legal, that the sequence of pain follows precedent, that the confession is properly witnessed, properly phrased. Do you affirm this of your own free will? He asks the man who's just been unstrapped from the chair, and if the man nods, bloodied, shaking, that's enough. The paper is signed, the ink dries. The truth, such as it is now official. Historians still argue about the extent of this legalism. Some claim it was window dressing, a thin veneer over brutal cruelty. Others believe the procedures mattered, that they shaped how torture was used, how often, and who survived it. What's clear is that a whole class of people existed around pain, not to inflict it directly, but to manage it. Torture wasn't just a scream in the dark. It was a job. A quirky fringe fact in some cities. Executioners were required to take oaths of conduct, much like priests or judges. They pledged to carry out sentences swiftly, to avoid unnecessary cruelty, and to maintain the tools in good order. There are records of executioners being fined for sloppiness, for cracking bones that should have only been bruised, or allowing prisoners to die too soon. Imagine that, a man punished for punishing too much. It's bureaucracy wrapped around brutality. You picture now a room where all of this happens. The accused lies on a bench. A clerk sharpens his quill. The physician checks the prisoner's pulse. The lawyer adjusts the wording on the confession scroll. The torturer waits by the tools, quiet, like a pianist before a concert. Everyone in that room has a role. No one speaks unnecessarily. Pain is about to be delivered, but not like a storm, like a prescription. This wasn't always heartless. Some of these men believed in what they were doing. The physician thought he was preserving life. The lawyer thought he was preserving truth. The clerk thought he was preserving order. Only the torturer, perhaps, was more ambiguous. Some records show signs of hesitation, even remorse. Notes in margins. Subject fainted, paused for recovery. Bled more than expected, reduced pressure. But none of these notations stopped the process, because no one in the room questioned the premise. They questioned only the execution of the task. A mainstream legal detail that's often forgotten is that confessions extracted under torture had to be repeated outside of torture to be valid. That's why the notary was so important. After the session ended, the accused would be cleaned, bandaged, given water, and asked to confirm their statement. If they did, it was binding. If they refused, the process could begin again. The body lied. The officials might say, "Let us see if it tells the truth tomorrow." And the next day, and the next. Some endured weeks of this cycle: interrogation, pain, recovery, reconfirmation. It wasn't fast, but it was effective. There's something uniquely unsettling about the way these rooms hid their purpose behind ritual. They didn't look like torture chambers. They looked like offices. You might find a crucifix on the wall, a legal codex on a shelf, a goblet of wine in the corner, and in the middle of it all, a man tied to a chair, screaming into the quiet. The contrast was deliberate. Pain delivered in a space that looked lawful, holy, reasonable. That's what made it so terrifying. If pain can exist in such order, then where doesn't it belong? Some of these technicians even left journals. One German executioner from the 16th century wrote of his work with clinical detachment. The woman confessed upon the third application of weights. Her breathing was distressed, but pulse steady, concluded within prescribed time. Another noted that certain body types endured stress better. The lean confessed sooner, the heavy endure longer. These weren't brutes, they were observers, and in their observations, they forgot the most important part, that the pain was not theirs. You imagine now being strapped down while these men confer quietly around you. The physician nods, the clerk dips his pen, the lawyer clears his throat. Begin. And then it happens. Not with drama, but with a single movement. A joint bends the wrong way. Your vision blooms white, but you're still alive. That's the point. You must stay alive, because the words haven't been spoken yet. And until they are, this room is your whole world. You might confess today. You might confess tomorrow. But it won't matter, because long after the truth is written, these men will move on to the next case. They will clean the tools, straighten the papers, adjust the lighting. They are not monsters. They are civil servants. Pain is not their passion. It's their process. And in this room, your voice, whether screaming or confessing, is just another entry in a ledger that never stops filling. You walk away now, slowly, from that chamber of order. And the memory that stays with you isn't the tool. It isn't the pain. It's the way everyone looked so calm, like nothing unusual had happened, like suffering was just another part of the job. By now, your mind feels stretched, pulled in too many directions by the memory of iron and fire and shame. But there's one question that still hangs in the back of your throat like a stone. How did they know it was working? Torture was never just physical. It was an act of persuasion, of psychological coercion. But pain, unlike truth, is unpredictable. So how did they measure it? How did they decide when it was enough? This next room answers that not with screams, but with speculation. There's no chair here, no spikes, no flames, just silence. And a long wooden table littered with reports, testimonies, diagrams, and oddly doodles. This was the room of assessment, where the professionals gathered not to inflict pain, but to analyze it. You're standing in the middle of medieval metrics now, and what they tried to measure wasn't just agony, it was authenticity. Pain had to look right. That was rule number 1. If someone screamed too early before the ropes tightened, before the heat came, they were faking it. Weak, manipulative, trying to cut a deal. But if someone stayed quiet too long, they were suspicious, possibly in league with the devil. Resistance was seen as unnatural. No one should be that strong. And so the torturers, along with the lawyers and the scribes, became amateur psychologists, judging by tone, twitch, tremor. How fast did the breath change? How long before the tears came? Did the victim look them in the eye or stare off into some otherworldly space? These were the signs. These were the data points. Historians have scoured thousands of records trying to piece together just how these evaluations worked. A mainstream fact, many torture sessions were interrupted on purpose, not because the pain had peaked, but because the victim's reaction didn't match expectations. Subject wept too soon, laughed during interrogation, feigns unconsciousness. These notations didn't stop the process. They escalated it. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If pain doesn't produce truth, increase the dosage. And if truth doesn't match the script, pain becomes punishment for lying. The feedback loop was flawless and inescapable. There's something bone-deep chilling in imagining a man hanging by his wrists, trying to decide whether to scream now or wait. Because if he cries too soon, he's soft. If he waits too long, he's a witch. There's no good move, only performances. And even then, the judges might disagree. You think of one inquisitor writing, his tears were wet, but not sincere. What does that even mean, wet, but not sincere? Like the water running from a cracked pipe, like grief without an audience. A fringe theory exists, rare, but persistent, that some inquisitors trained themselves to detect true screams, that they believed certain vocal frequencies revealed honesty, that a genuine confession could be heard in the shape of the cry. No science supported this, of course, but it fit the era's obsession with signs and signals. One man's voice broke into a high, keening wail, and it was marked as false. Another groaned low and ragged, and the priest nodded. That is truth. You weren't judged on what you said. You were judged on how believable your agony sounded. And this performance wasn't just for the torturers, it was for the clerks, the notaries, the apprentices learning the craft. Some were trained to identify acts of deception, eye movement, muscle resistance, the way the body leaned into or away from the pain. Manuals existed, some lost, some recovered, explaining how to interpret each flinch, and when in doubt, increase pressure. The body, they believed, always told the truth eventually, even if the mouth didn't. A mainstream psychological insight one understood now but grasped intuitively back then is that pain produces desperation, not honesty. People under extreme stress will say what they think the torturer wants to hear, not what's true. And yet the system demanded confession. And so pain became a key, clumsy, crude, but devastatingly effective at opening any door. And behind those doors, half-truths, hallucinations, guesses, names spoken in panic, stories invented on the fly, all of it recorded, all of it archived. You imagine now a woman tied to the chair, her body trembling not from the iron beneath her, but from uncertainty. She wants to confess. She wants it to end. But she doesn't know what they want. So she starts with the truth. They don't believe her. She adds a few details. They nod. But press further. She makes up a name. They smile. And so she builds a fiction, brick by brick, until they say, that's enough. And only then does she realize the story she's told will be used to torture someone else tomorrow. The pain doesn't just stay in one room. It travels. One particularly unsettling detail found in Inquisition transcripts is the phrase revised confession. It appears often, a confession made under duress, then revised later either under more pain, or after the victim is told that their truth isn't good enough. Imagine being told your scream was too weak, your guilt too small. Tell us again. They say, this time, mean it. And if you hesitate, the rope returns, the iron heats, the cycle resets. There's a bizarre elegance to how the machinery of pain was made to appear rational. Everything noted, everything measured. Torturers weren't improvising, they were observing. A scribe might record. Subject resisted until the 6th turn, began crying on the 7th, confessed on the 8th. It reads like a recipe, but what it really is a ledger of brokenness, line by line, confessions turned into math, pain into policy. Even more surreal is how the torturers sometimes doubted themselves. Marginal notes reveal hesitation. One clerk wrote, subject screamed before tool touched him. Fear may have replaced pain. Another mused. He named his mother, possibly delirious. These glimpses of human doubt vanish quickly beneath protocol, but they are there. Proof that someone in the middle of all that structure still wondered. And perhaps the strangest part, some of the accused withstood it. Somehow, they didn't confess, or they confessed and recanted, or they endured long enough to break the script. And the torturers, those stewards of regulated pain, didn't always know what to do then, because the system depended on the breaking point. Without it, the record was incomplete, and so they labeled these cases carefully resistant, unyielding, suspiciously silent. The system couldn't admit failure. It just reframed it. You picture the final signature on a page shaky, blood-streaked, barely legible. That's the endpoint, but not for the accused, for the record, for the court. The pain may continue. The recovery may never come, but the system got what it wanted. A line in the ledger, a seal of closure. You leave the table now, covered in its parchment and dried ink, and the silence in the room isn't peaceful. It's clinical. It reminds you that the sharpest edge in history wasn't iron. It was certainty, the belief that pain could be measured, that truth could be forced, that a human being could be reduced to a pattern of reactions, scored like music, and called confession. And finally, you step into a room that feels less like a chamber and more like a tomb, not of stone, but of memory. Here, the air is dry, the dust is thick, the light doesn't flicker, it's just absent. This is the place where torture ends, not with screams or broken bones, but with quiet. In this final room, the tools are still, the racks are idle, the ropes have frayed from time, not tension. This is where the implements sleep, long after the hands that wielded them have rotted away. You walk past them now, lined along shelves like relics, each one once intimate with flesh. Some still hold dried stains, though no one says whether it's rust or something else. You run a finger across a pair of manacles and realize these didn't kill. They held, they waited, and in a way, they're still waiting. The long fate of torture wasn't sudden. It didn't vanish overnight like a banished curse. It eroded, quietly, as law shifted and ideas evolved. A mainstream historical fact, by the late 18th century, formal judicial torture was being outlawed across much of Europe. Enlightenment thinkers began to argue, often in books more than courtrooms, that truth born from agony was unreliable, that justice required reason, not torment, and so the wheels stopped turning. The racks were dismantled, the hooks were unscrewed and tucked away in storage rooms, and eventually, in museums. But make no mistake, the ideas behind them never died. Only the furniture changed. Historians still argue why torture fell out of favor. Was it ethics law, a better understanding of the human mind, or just bureaucracy shifting toward efficiency? Because while the rituals of medieval pain took time and manpower, the new justice systems wanted speed, detainment, silence, confessions written in ink, not blood. Trials moved from the square to the courtroom, from spectacle to paperwork. But beneath it all, that same question lingered: how do you make someone talk? A fringe theory suggests that many of the old devices were quietly recycled, smelted down for other uses, their iron reborn in prison gates or police shackles. Others were kept deliberately, displayed in law halls or schools as cautionary symbols. This is what we used to do, the professors would say. And yet, the shape of the mask, the curve of the chair, the stretch of the rack, they all lingered in the back of the mind. Because the ghost of torture doesn't vanish. It adapts. You stand now before a glass case imagined, of course holding one final object, a confession scroll, yellowed with time. The signature is faint, the ink blots where the hand shook, and beside it, a note statement confirmed under duress. Recanted post-trial, subject deceased. That's all that remains. Not the cry, not the body, just a record. A fragment of bureaucracy wrapped around a life that no longer exists. It's chilling not because of what it says, but because of what it doesn't. Who was this person? What did they truly believe? Did they lie to survive or die, trying to stay honest? No one knows. The file is closed. The system moved on. And now, centuries later, people walk through museums and point at the Iron Maiden. They peer into the Judas cradle. They chuckle nervously at the pair of anguish. They say, "Can you believe this was real?" But few stop long enough to ask what it meant. These were not props. They were philosophies, sculpted ideologies. They were the physical form of an invisible belief that suffering can produce truth, that pain can be organized, and that the body is the most honest witness when it screams. Even now, modern interrogations echo with the past. The rooms have padded walls. The lights are fluorescent. The tools are cleaner. The voices calmer. But the goal is the same: break the silence. And somewhere, a technician still watches the clock. A lawyer still records the words. A physician still nods at the subject's vitals. The chairs no longer have spikes, but they still restrain. The ropes have become handcuffs. The scripts are more polite. But truth, under pressure, still walks a crooked path. You turn away from the final display and find yourself not in a dungeon, but a hallway. A long corridor that stretches toward something quieter than history, something like forgetting. This is where the story softens, where the memories lose their edges, where the instruments of pain become curiosities, and the people who suffered are no longer names, but figures. The accused, the heretic, the thief. Their voices don't follow you, but their absence does. Because the most disturbing thing about torture is not how it breaks the body, It's how it rewrites reality. A man enters a chamber with truth on his tongue. He leaves with whatever version keeps his fingers intact. And centuries later, we read his confession as if it were fact. We quote it. We footnote it. We place it on plaques beside museum exhibits. But we forget what it cost to write it. That's the true echo of pain, not the scream, but the silence that follows. The altered truth, the wound wrapped in words. And so the tools rust, the documents fade, the laws change, but human nature, that's slower. Somewhere inside us still lives the belief that suffering reveals the soul, that if we press hard enough, truth will rise like steam, and until that belief dies, torture, whatever form it takes, will never fully leave us. You walk out now into the open air. No more shadows, no more iron, just the sound of your own breath and the strange comfort of distance. But even as the cold wind brushes your face, something lingers behind your ribs. A shape, a sound, the weight of too many names never spoken, too many stories smothered by official ink. And you wonder not for the first time how many truths were lost in the name of truth. And now, slowly, we let it all settle. The iron grows cold again. The flames dim. The screams fade, not because they were quiet, but because you've stepped far enough away to let them rest. You've seen what pain can build, what belief can justify, and what silence can destroy. But this story, harsh as it was, does not follow you home. You're not bound. You're not on trial. You are only listening, and listening is what the world needs more of. Take a breath. Let it stay with you for a moment. Let your shoulders soften. The rooms you walked through, the chambers, the squares, the candlelit ledgers, they dissolve now, like old dreams upon waking. The faces you imagined, the tools you tried not to touch, they drift into fog. You've carried them long enough for tonight. If your thoughts still echo, let them. Don't resist. Let your mind soften its grip. Let it wander. Let it drift. Imagine a quiet library where no records are written, a silent chapel with no judgment, a world where pain is not persuasion and fear is not fact. That place exists, even if only in this moment, right now, with you. Close your eyes if they haven't already. Let the breath slow just slightly more. You're safe here. No ropes, no questions, only the hush of night around you. You've heard enough. You've remembered enough. And now, you rest.